Hey all, I'm Chess here, and today I'm going to be trying to explain pawns in chess, how they work, how they move, how they capture, and various rules such as queening and en passant. So let's get into some gameplay. Here we can see the standard setup for a chessboard, and as you can see the pawns for white are on the 2nd rank, the pawns for black are on the 7th rank. Now, from start, pawns can move 2 places forwards. As you can see here, I have played the pawn from e2 to e4. They do not have to move 2 places forward, so black here could play e7 to e6, and this is totally fine. They don't have to move 2 places forward. They can do. After the pawn has been played 2 places forward, it can no longer go 2 places forward. From now on, the pawn can only move 1 forward. If we tried to move 2 forward, say it's just not going to let us. Now the pawn captures in a very specific way. The pawn, as you can see here on g5, can capture diagonally on f4, and this is how pawns capture. They capture diagonally. As an example for white, this pawn on e5 can capture diagonally on d6 here, and it can do so. So let's go back to the start. Now, pawns are generally used for center control, and what this means is, for example, playing a pawn e2 to e4, this pawn now controls the square d5, and it also controls the square f5, because if the pawn is played here, the white pawn can simply take, and black can also do the same and try and control these areas, but a simple development move like knight to f3 would sort of undermine this pawn, and we can then play d4. So now these 2 pawns here have control of this square, this square, this square, and this square. Pawns are very useful for center control, as they allow us to control 2 squares of the board, and they can also be used to protect each other. These pawns which protect each other are known as pawn chains, and what these do, these are basically, as it sounds, chains of pawns which protect each other. The basics of a pawn chain is that the front pawn in the chain cannot be taken without taking the pawn but below it first, and it is possible to take, as you can see, but then it can retake, so it doesn't have much of an effect. A pawn chain is very solid. See, as you can see here for black, this pawn here is attacking these 2 squares. It can't be taken by my knight because it's the head of a pawn chain and cannot be taken by, and it will be retaken by d6 or f6. f6 here, as an example, is in the middle of a pawn chain, and this acts just like the head of a pawn chain, because this pawn cannot be taken, as g7 can go ahead and recapture. Now we're going to go over some disadvantages, well, not disadvantages, but how pawns can become liabilities. So the first one I'm going to go over is an isolated pawn. And for an example, we're going to imagine that these d2, this d2 pawn, and this f2 pawn aren't here. And what this means is that this pawn is all alone, and there is no d3 move, so this pawn is unprotected. If we want to protect this pawn, we're going to have to use other pieces to try and protect it. We can't use the pawn because it's because these 2 pawns wouldn't be here if it was an isolated pawn. Isolated pawns can be liabilities, as pressure can be built up on them, for example. And now I've only got 1 piece protecting, whereas he's got 2 pieces attacking. So this isolated pawn has become a bit of a liability, unfortunately. Something else which can happen with pawns is where pawns double up, and what this means is that pawns end up having 2 in a row, for example. I'll go over a simple example of this. And here, this bishop is attacking this knight on c6, which is defended by the pawns d7 and b7. If he plays, say, knight to f6, what I can now do, I can take here, and this pawn can recapture, say, here. Now, if we look what's happened, there is a double pawn on the C file. This file here is C. This is the C file. And the basic liability of this is that this pawn is trapped, and this pawn is going to have much less support as it's only protected by this pawn at the moment. And if we ever want to move this pawn here on c7, we need to move this forward first and then move this pawn. And also, it's opened up this file, which could potentially be dangerous if, say, there was a rook here, because the rook will eye down on this file. Something else which is useful for a pawn is called an outpost, and because this pawn here protects the d5 and the f5 square, these squares can be used for a minor piece to sit on, and these would allow this piece to be protected. For example, this really wouldn't happen in a game. This is just an example of an outpost. And here, this pawn is protecting this knight here, and if say this pawn wasn't here, this knight would be very, very strong, because it can't be. They'll have to take with, say, another knight, and this pawn can then retake. And this is an outpost. It's an outpost for another piece. So now we'll go over 2 of the rules that separate pawns from other pieces. One of these is en passant, and basically what this means is, say, if I play here, takes. Now, if I play c3, if I play c4, this pawn obviously would not be able to take this pawn, as it can't take sideways. However, as a rule of chess, and as a rare rule, this pawn can now come to the position of where the pawn would have been if it had only moved 1 piece, and it can capture. Another example, if this pawn moves here, this pawn's moved 2 places, but this pawn can take as if it would have only moved 1 place. Now that is en passant. Now, queening is where the pawn reaches the 8th or the 1st rank, and what this does, this allows you to promote this pawn to any piece that you'd like. Typically, you're going to want a queen, but a knight can also be useful if the king's in a position that allows check. If you promote to anything less than a queen, it is known as under promoting. It's totally fine, and in some cases the knight can be useful to put the king in check. So that's my video on explaining pawns. I hope that you've got something out of it, and I hope to see you next time when I'll do another minor piece such as a knight. Bye.